Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. Today, I am so happy to bring you my interview with Sasha Chavkin, reporter for the Examination News. Sasha recently published an article in collaboration with the Washington Post titled, "As Obesity Rises, Big Food and Dietitians Push Anti-Diet Advice," along with co-authors Anjali Tu, Caitlin Gilbert, and Anat O'Connor. This will be the first episode focused on this article. Today, Sasha talks to me about the article and its origins. He also provides additional information on some of the people and organizations mentioned in the article, and shares a letter to the editor from Janet Tomiyama, a researcher at UCLA. To give the conversation some framing, I'll share a few relevant details from the article here. I'll also link to it in the show notes. The article starts with the story of Jaye Rochon, a 51-year-old YouTuber from Wisconsin who took the advice of anti-diet influencers and ended up gaining weight. The article then discusses the cereal company General Mills and that it's capitalizing on the teachings of the anti-diet movement. The article then talks about dietitians who use the hashtags No Bad Foods, Food Freedom, and Ditch the Diet, and say these dietitians have co-opted anti-diet messages. It then makes a claim that the majority of the influencers who use anti-diet language were paid to promote products from food, beverage, and supplement companies. The article gives us some obesity statistics right before saying, quote, "The anti-diet approach essentially shifts accountability for the health crisis away from the food industry for creating ultra-processed junk foods laden with food additives, sugars, and artificial sweeteners," end quote. The article goes on to talk about General Mills and how they have done their own research, finding that cereals are beneficial to consumers' health and that food shaming led to lower self-esteem, eating disorders, and made people more likely to avoid the cereal aisle in grocery stores. The article then claims that the anti-diet movement has been distorted and that anti-diet influencers are spreading an alarming amount of misinformation. Here is where the Association for Size Diversity and Health, as well as Elise Resch, 50% of the duo who brought us intuitive eating, critique the current anti-diet space and the use of the language by General Mills. The article ends with Jaye Rochon talking about how gaining weight has negatively impacted her, and she shares that she has left the anti-diet movement. For this interview, I submitted my questions to Sasha for approval 6 days before our interview. He declined a few, but kept most. We then went back and forth about whether the Washington Post would sign off on this interview. Sasha and I were in conversation about the Post's concerns about me through Sunday, before getting final approval to record Monday at 8 a.m. Pacific. Specifically, the editors had concerns that the conversation would devolve into something that wouldn't paint them in a favorable light. And for those of you who have listened to the episode I did with Dr. Robert Lustig and others, you'll know that I don't debate or devolve, even when I absolutely and fundamentally disagree with someone. So I guess the problem wasn't me. The problem was who the Post assumes me to be. And I love an opportunity to prove people wrong, so I'm glad that Sasha and I were able to record this episode. Before we start, I will be transparent and let you know up front that I am the awkward one in this interview. Sasha was great. Submitting specific questions in advance, having a tightly contained interview, and not having a natural, free-flowing conversation isn't my norm. When there were follow-up questions that weren't on the original list, I first confirmed I could ask them. I was so focused on restraining myself, I even knocked over my coffee mug halfway through. So if you hear any rigidity in my voice or questions that seem out of order, it's not just you. A quick disclosure that I worked with the Washington Post in 2021 on a column about nutrition myths. I didn't work with a journalist in this article, nor with the well-being division of the Washington Post. And with that, Sasha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jessica.
Absolutely. Can you tell us about the examination and its goals?
So the Examination is a nonprofit newsroom that launched just last September. We do investigative reporting on global public health. We investigate preventable health threats and try to empower people who are affected by them. We often partner with other newsrooms, and we've done collaborations with the Washington Post and the New York Times. But we've also worked with smaller newsrooms like, for example, the Musiba Project, which is a small newsroom in Cameroon who we partnered with to do a story about a lead battery plant that was lead poisoning the community. So our focus is global, and we're trying to do journalism that empowers people to be healthier.
Excellent. Can you tell us about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so I've been an investigative reporter for more than a decade, and I've focused on international stories mostly. That's covered topics from the World Bank funding projects that displaced local communities that were in the way of development projects, to exposing the offshore financial dealings of Wilbur Ross, who was the Commerce Secretary during the Trump administration. And, like the examination, of focus for me is trying to do stories that lead to positive change. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one story that really meant a lot to me was an investigation I did years ago about the process for forgiving student loans for borrowers who become fully disabled and can't work. We found that process was so dysfunctional, it was leaving severely disabled people buried in student debt. And it helped lead the federal government to forgive almost $6 billion in student loans that were held by disabled borrowers. So, that's the kind of story and the kind of positive change that I try to contribute to with my work.
Let's get into it. Can you tell us about your recent investigation and article?
Yes. So this was actually a two-part project. The first part of the story came out last fall, and we looked into dietitian influencers on social media. We found that many were sponsored by food and beverage companies to promote their products. And we found that some had engaged in campaigns by industry groups to defend the health and safety of their products without properly disclosing that they were paid by those industries. Mm-hmm. Then the second investigation, which came out earlier this month, it followed from the first, and it looked into how the food industry is capitalizing on the anti-diet movement. We found from a data analysis that food companies are disproportionately sponsoring anti-diet dietitian influencers. And we also went deeper into General Mills, the cereal company, which has taken this strategy a whole step further. They've not only worked with influencers who promoted their cereals on social media using the hashtag #DerailTheShame, but they sponsored a study into food shaming, which found that people who reported being food shamed, had higher rates of mental health problems, experienced isolation. It also said that they were more likely to avoid the cereal aisle in grocery stores. And General Mills then went on to use the findings of this study to push back against a proposed federal regulation that would add front-of-package health information to food labels. And General Mills basically made the case that indicating if a food was high in sugar or fat or another unhealthy ingredient would be food shaming consumers, and therefore they opposed it.
In the article, it leads with Jaye Rochon. The article mentions her concerns about weight stigma and her worries about her health, and positions an anti-diet dietitian as the cause for these.
So Jaye Rochon was a woman whose experience we featured in the article. She's a video editor who lives in Wisconsin. She had struggled with weight loss diets for a long time. And then she encountered anti-diet influencers on YouTube who encouraged her to take a completely different approach, to stop restricting foods, to stop avoiding the food she was staying away from. And as a result of taking that advice, she gained a lot of weight in a short period of time. She started really worrying about her health, and she's now speaking out and sharing her experience because she doesn't want other people to go down that same path. The people who put her on that path were YouTube influencers who she followed. One of the influencers who she mentioned following most closely was Christy Harrison, who is a dietitian and a leading figure in the anti-diet movement. Mm-hmm. Our story didn't say that she had a personal dietitian, but rather that she followed online influencers.
Got it.
Including dietitians who set her on this path.
Got it. And for folks who are listening, I can link to her YouTube in the show notes because she has her own YouTube, right?
Yeah, she does.
Okay. And then a few dietitians were named in the article. Can you tell us how you chose those?
Yeah, certainly I can speak generally to our process. By far the most significant factor was that we looked at people who were involved in the campaigns we were writing about. So in the first article, we looked at campaigns by the American Beverage Association that was defending the safety of aspartame and pushing back against health warnings from the World Health Organization, and also a campaign by Canadian Sugar, which was a Canadian sugar industry group. Mm-hmm. And then our second story focused on General Mills and this Derail the Shame campaign that they organized. So the majority of dietitians mentioned in the story were ones who participated in those campaigns. Mm-hmm. I also I wanted to go back to your previous question about Jaye, because I think maybe part of what you're asking there is why we chose Jaye and how we chose to focus on her story. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So I think a big part of it was that she was willing to speak out. We encountered dozens of people on Reddit, in YouTube comments, on other platforms who had testimonies about experiences of all kinds with the anti-diet movement. The vast majority of those people did not want to share their stories publicly. And, which I think speaks to the power of weight stigma in our society. I think it also speaks to people who are concerned about responses they might get from all directions of people whose approaches they were criticizing, who they felt might attack them for speaking out. But Jaye was very courageous, and she was also very clear that she wanted to do this to help other people. I actually reached out to her and asked if I could share more extended comment that she made during our interview. And, Jaye is 52 years old. And part of why she said she shared her experience is she wanted to offer her perspective as a somewhat older person than many of the commenters she encountered on social media. And here's what she said about why she left the movement. So I think that's really it. Just age catches up to you. And you're like, when I was 30, I was able to be pretty obese and keep up with everybody. As you get older and older, you can't. I just want to share my story. I want to share what this did to me and how hard it is to get out of it, especially at 50, because there are not a lot of midlifers on YouTube talking about how hard it is. And I know people have different perspectives on Jaye's experience, but I want to be really clear that this is someone who's been through a lot and is speaking up because she wants to help other people.
Do you know if after leaving the anti-diet movement, if she's lost weight or if her weight has maintained?
She said she has lost some weight. She's continuing to try to lose weight and also just to be healthier more broadly. I don't know the details of where she is in that process.
Details on like her health and stuff like that.
I mean, Jaye is trying to change her diet and her lifestyle to try to be healthier. She very candidly described that as a work in progress. And that's why she's speaking out, because she wants to share her experience with other people who may have encountered the same challenges.
Christy was mentioned in the article. Are you able to share more about that portion and your conversation with her?
Christy Harrison had a podcast that Jaye said she listened to and that was influential for her when she was following an anti-diet approach. Christy Harrison wrote a book, Anti-Diet, which numerous people in the movement mentioned to us as very influential. And in that book, Christy Harrison devotes an entire chapter to disputing some of the health risks that are connected to excess weight, particularly its connections with chronic disease. I mean, the chapter states, and we mentioned this in the story, most chronic diseases blamed on weight can most likely be explained by other phenomena, such as weight stigma and weight cycling. Mm-hmm. We reached out to Christy Harrison about that statement, and she actually backed up from it a little bit when we contacted her. She said if she was writing the book today, she would use more nuanced language. Mm-hmm. She also emphasized that she still opposes intentional weight loss, and she thinks that stigma and yo-yo dieting are contributors to many chronic diseases. Yeah. But again, there were several instances of figures or literature in the anti-diet movement that made this kind of claim and then backed up from it when we asked them about it.
Health at Every Size and ASDA were also mentioned in the article, and I know that they have been very outspoken about weight stigma and, chronic diseases caused by other factors. Is that something, a parallel or a connection that you found there?
So one thing that we looked at in this story was there were a series of HAES health sheets that were posted online, which are sponsored by ASDA. Yeah. And, many of those health sheets disputed the connections between various diseases and health conditions and weight. There was one about type 2 diabetes that said, for example, you cannot eat your way to type 2 diabetes. And when we asked some of the leaders of ASDA about that, they said they actually hadn't vetted those health sheets and that they were not necessarily endorsing the claims that were made there.
First of all, I didn't know that, and that's fascinating. I feel like I missed that in the article.
So it just for reasons of length and space, it didn't make it in, but we did have an exchange with them about that. And
in the article specifically about the co-optation, ASDA or Health at Every Size is mentioned that the hashtag Health at Every Size is often used to promote body positivity or suggest that, quote, you can be healthy at any size. And that one was a surprise to me because from my understanding of Health at Every Size, that you can be healthy at every size. So that one was surprising to me.
Yeah, we were really surprised by that as well, to be honest. And, we spoke in detail with Angel Austin, who's the interim executive director of ASDA, and Annie Jansen, who's the project and operations leader. Mm-hmm. And they really emphasized this point that their movement is about access to healthcare and opposing weight discrimination.
Okay.
They talked about how the movement was born back in the 60s from people in larger bodies who were being poorly treated by doctors, often were not getting diagnosed properly, were being told to lose weight regardless of what their symptoms were. Mm-hmm. And so they emphasized that their movement is about equal access to healthcare and fighting weight discrimination. Mm-hmm. They feel that that's been distorted into something much more commercial on social media. And I reached out to them as well. And I'd like to share with you some of the comments that Angel Austin made in more detail.
That'd be great.
So she's talking about the idea of health at every size here. She said, unfortunately, there are different people that have different concepts and ideas about it that are sometimes misguided. And the wrong people are being centered a lot of times. There's a lot of focus on maybe people even in smaller bodies, people who are in quote unquote more acceptable bodies. It kind of comes around to like a body positivity thing more so than an actual fat acceptance or anti-fat oppression. So they really wanted us to know and the public to know their focus was on health access for people who suffered most from the discrimination in our system. And they also explicitly made the point that dietitians promoting packaged foods was not doing anything to promote the goal of equal access to healthcare for everyone.
Got it. So like using the hashtag under these same like General Mills post was for them not connected at all. Is that right?
Yeah, they said that that's really not what their movement is about. And they want to make sure people understand that this is about people who are really suffering under our current system and not a message that should be generic body positivity, or frankly, a message used to sell sugary cereal.
Overall, can you tell us how you got interested in specifically the dietitians?
Yeah, the second story really emerged from our first one. We had looked at these campaigns by the American Beverage Association, which is a sugar industry lobbying group, where essentially they had been paying dietitians to say that the World Health Organization was wrong when it issued warnings about the safety of aspartame. There was another campaign by the Canadian Sugar Association, where they were paying dietitians to say that the health risks from sugar were overblown. And there were dietitians in both of those campaigns who didn't properly disclose that they were being paid by those industry groups as they disseminated those messages. We found that a number of the dietitians involved in those campaigns were part of the anti-diet movement, that they regularly used anti-diet language, or in many cases, even self-identified in their social media handles and bios as anti-diet. And that made us curious. And so we actually went back to our original data set that we had used for the first story and did an additional analysis. And what that analysis found, again, we were looking at 68 dietitian influencers who had more than 10,000 followers. We found that about 40% of them regularly used anti-diet language in their posts, and that of the ones who used anti-diet language, a majority also did promotions for the food and beverage industry. So that data analysis showed that the food industry was disproportionately sponsoring anti-diet dietitians to promote their messages and their products.
Was it like big food, or what would be like considered big food? Or was it also like weird wellness-y products that they were being asked to sponsor? Overall, it seems like the anti-diet dietitians were more likely or more targeted for these ads.
It was a wide variety of products. So there were big food groups like the American Beverage Association, which represents Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. And then, there were people promoting supplements for fish oil and things like that. So a wide variety of products.
And then to clarify, at the beginning, you had said public health recommendations, and just now we were talking about the WHO. So I'm curious, like, where are you all pulling your public health information, if you don't mind sharing?
Well, in the context of the first story, we were talking about these campaigns that were sponsored by industry to push back against a recommendation by the WHO, essentially not to use artificial sweeteners for weight management or diabetes. And that is what chronologically appeared to help prompt this campaign by the soda industry. And, the WHO is a public health body. So one of the strongest reactions we got both from ethics experts and readers was that they felt this conduct was particularly troubling. The idea that dietitians would engage in an industry-sponsored campaign to push back on public health recommendations, and particularly that they would do so without properly disclosing their affiliation.
Do you think that what we eat is a primary factor in the development of disease?
Well, we spoke to a lot of experts for this story, and they told us that nutrition plays a major role in these conditions, as do other factors, including social determinants of health, which I know is something that the anti-diet movement has focused on. But there was a lot of consensus that nutrition, and particularly the quality of the U.S. food supply, are a big part of this story. And, when you look at the story, it's a pretty alarming bigger picture. According to CDC data, almost 42% of US adults have obesity, which is roughly twice the rate of other industrialized countries. There was a study in Lancet in 2022 that estimated that nearly half a million Americans die early each year as a result of excess body weight. So there are really serious public health threats out there, and there's a lot of evidence connecting those to diet. So I think where the evidence is strong is that we shouldn't be shutting down the conversation about the role of diet and food supply in our health. I think the food industry would like that, but I think that would be a disservice to public health more broadly.
Yeah, when you were looking at the Instagram and social media of the anti-diet community, do you feel like they were shutting down the argument entirely, or say focusing on social determinants of health? I
think that there certainly is a focus on social determinants of health, which I think is a very valid part of the picture. But I think that nutrition is a huge part of the picture as well, and that I don't think it should be a competition. I think we should be able to talk about both of these things and understand that they're both a real part of some really serious public health problems facing the country.
I got it. So when it comes to food and nutrition and playing the impact, do you think that everyone gets to make choices about what they eat?
Well, I think obviously there's huge inequity in access to food and access to healthy food. And I think that there are many reasons for that. But that a big part of it is the food supply in our country. And that is affected by the decisions made by the companies that provide that supply. So I think if we care about people having access to healthy food, we have to be open to talking about some of the decisions made by the food industry as a part of that conversation.
All right. I will continue to think about that one. When you and I had initially chatted, you were mentioning that when you had conducted your initial interviews, there was a lot of critique of studies that were funded by pharmaceutical companies when it came to weight loss.
Yeah, certainly one of the common arguments made by anti-diet advocates is that a lot of the research on obesity and health is funded by the weight loss industry, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or weight loss organizations or other people who have a vested interest. And, I think those are valid concerns. I think if we agree on that standard more broadly, then it's also important to look at what the role of the food industry is in promoting messages by health professionals, including health professionals in the anti-diet movement.
And then among anti-diet dietitians, what do you think is some of the misinformation that is being spread, particularly by the anti-diet movement?
Well, I think one of the messages that experts were most concerned about was the idea that excess weight is not really a serious health risk, and particularly that it doesn't add to the risk for chronic disease. We spoke before about type 2 diabetes, heart disease is another illness that falls into that category. And experts were adamant that, there's a lot of evidence supporting the idea that poor diet and excess weight place people in danger.
What do you think the original messaging of the anti-diet movement is, and how have you found it to be co-opted by today's anti-diet dietitians?
Well, again, according to the leaders of ASDA, this was really about fighting weight discrimination and about ensuring equal access to healthcare. So their message, as we discussed before, was that when it instead becomes about generic body positivity or about promoting certain foods, that is very different from what the movement was originally about.
Gotcha. What feedback have you gotten on the article? I will just say that I've seen it in at least 5 other places, including random Chris Cuomo podcast. I don't even know what he's doing, but he was talking about it. So yeah, it's been around. What feedback have you gotten both from other people you've interviewed or other places?
Yeah, so it's been really good to see that the article is getting read. And I think for me, one of the most significant responses has been from people in the anti-diet movement who share these concerns. I talked about Asda and Elise Resch. Another person who spoke up about this was Janet Tomiyama, who's a leading anti-diet researcher at UCLA. And she actually wrote a letter to the editor of the Washington Post.
Oh.
What she wrote is, companies such as General Mills might be embracing the cultural anti-diet movement. But what is clear from the Post's article is that big food and influencers sponsored by it are co-opting an extremely important and potentially revolutionary anti-diet message to make money selling sugary cereals and processed foods. Okay. This is not only underhanded, but also harmful to public health. And that was Janet Tomiyama's response. We also did this story based on having closely followed social media for a while. So we've seen that there's been a lot of response on social media, including from people who didn't like our article and aren't happy with the way that we presented it. What I would say to that is that's okay. If I couldn't take criticism, I would be in the wrong job. And I'd also be pretty hypocritical as well. But we are paying close attention to those responses and we take seriously what people are saying.
Thank you so much for your time today. I know this was not easy to make happen. So thank you, Sasha, so much for coming on and chatting.
Yeah. No, thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate it. And I think it's great that you're doing this, and I appreciate how you've handled it as well.
Thanks so much again to Sasha for coming on the show and to the Washington Post for letting it happen. As you can imagine, this won't be the last episode about this article. Sasha mentioned that there were critics of the article, and Clara Nozick at Your Dietitian BFF is one of them. She has a 4-part series on TikTok that you can check out. She's actually part of the reason that this interview almost didn't happen. I'll discuss that with her and her thoughts on the article in an upcoming interview. You can expect that one in a couple of weeks. And as always, if you have feedback on this episode, comments, or concerns that you would like to share, you can email them or send a voice memo to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. And do let me know if I'm able to share them in an episode. Next week, I'm so excited to introduce you all to Noreen Hunani, the creator behind Arties for Neurodiversity on Instagram. We talk about neurodivergence, ARFID, the construct of picky eating, and what the dietetics field gets wrong. Until next time, make it awkward, friends. This has been Making It Awkward. I'm Jessica Wilson. The best way to support the show is by rating, reviewing, and sharing it with a friend. You can become a sustaining Patreon member of the show, which will support the editing and episode mixing of our very own Jen Jacobs. You'll also get bonus content and extra dad content when you join the Patreon. This is a production of The Body Politic and is supported by Patreon members and the Legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services.